By early 1944, the German High Command understood that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was inevitable. The only uncertainty concerned its location and timing. German intelligence assessed multiple potential landing zones along the Atlantic coast, from Norway to southern France. Among these possibilities, Normandy was widely regarded as secondary. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, appointed Inspector General of Coastal Defenses and later commander of Army Group B, arrived in France with a mandate to strengthen the Atlantic Wall. His task was defensive. His conclusions were operational. Rommel's experience in North Africa had shaped his understanding of modern warfare. He observed that Allied air superiority fundamentally altered battlefield dynamics. Movement by day was increasingly impossible. Reserves could not be shifted rapidly once an invasion began. Command flexibility depended on preventing the enemy from establishing a foothold. From these observations, Rommel derived a central assessment. The invasion had to be stopped at the shoreline. This view placed him at odds with prevailing German doctrine. Traditional German operational thinking emphasized mobile defense. Senior commanders, including Field Marshal Geert von Rundstedt, believed that armored reserves should be held inland and committed once the main Allied landing had revealed itself. They assumed that a decisive counterattack could destroy the invasion force after it landed. Rommel rejected this assumption. He warned repeatedly that Allied air power would prevent large-scale armored movement after the landings began. Tanks held inland, he argued, would arrive too late. Beaches lost in the first hours would never be retaken. Throughout the winter and spring of 1944, Rommel ordered extensive defensive preparations along the coast. Beach obstacles were increased. Minefields were expanded. Artillery positions were reinforced. Infantry divisions were pushed closer to the shoreline, often against resistance from other commanders who feared vulnerability to naval bombardment. Rommel's reports emphasized urgency. He argued that Normandy, though not the most obvious landing site, possessed key characteristics favorable to the Allies. It lay within range of British air cover. It offered suitable beaches. It avoided the heavily fortified Pas-de-Calais, where German defenses were strongest. Despite this, his warnings failed to alter strategic assumptions at the highest level. German intelligence remained fixated on Calais. Allied deception operations reinforced this belief. False radio traffic, double agents, and visible troop concentrations in southeastern England supported the narrative that the main invasion would strike the shortest route across the Channel. Rommel's assessment conflicted with both intelligence reports and institutional bias. Normandy was viewed as a diversionary option. Defensive resources continued to be distributed accordingly. Compounding this failure was command fragmentation. Rommel lacked authority over armored reserves. Control of key panzer divisions remained with higher command and, in some cases, required direct authorization from Adolf Hitler himself. This structure guaranteed delay. Rommel documented these concerns in formal communications. He warned that hesitation during the opening hours of an invasion would be fatal. He stated that the outcome of the war in the West would be decided on the beaches. These warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. On 6th of June 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. German response was fragmented. Armored units remained immobilized for critical hours. Command authorization lagged. Beach defenses, though extensive, lacked the mass required to repel the landings outright. By the time German reserves moved, Allied forces had established secure lodgements. Rommel's assessment proved accurate. The battle was decided before German doctrine could be applied. The failure to heed his warning was not the result of ignorance. It was the consequence of institutional rigidity, divided command authority, and misplaced confidence in pre-war assumptions. The cost of ignoring Rommel's conclusions would be measured not in hours, but in the irreversible loss of Western Europe. In the months preceding June 1944, German senior command reached conclusions about the coming Allied invasion that appeared logical within the framework of their existing doctrine. These conclusions were not careless. They were derived from precedent, intelligence assessments, and long-standing operational beliefs formed before Allied air supremacy had fully matured. At the center of these assumptions was the belief that the decisive phase of any invasion would occur after the landing, not during it. German operational doctrine emphasized counter-offensive maneuver. Since the early campaigns of the war, success had been achieved by allowing an enemy to advance, identify his main effort, and then destroy him through concentrated armored counterattack. This concept had worked repeatedly against opponents who lacked air superiority and logistical depth. Senior commanders believed the same principles applied in 1944. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, argued that no coastal defense system could permanently stop a major amphibious landing. In his assessment, fixed defenses could delay, but not defeat, a determined enemy supported by naval gunfire. The decisive action, therefore, had to occur inland, where German armored forces could operate with freedom and mass. This view was widely shared within the German High Command. Panzer divisions were considered Germany's primary operational asset. Their preservation was seen as essential. Committing them too close to the coast risked destruction by Allied naval artillery and air attack before they could be employed decisively. Holding them back preserved flexibility and allowed concentration against the enemy's main thrust. This assumption depended on one critical condition: freedom of movement. German planners assumed that armored units could be shifted rapidly once the true invasion site was identified. Rail networks, road systems, and command coordination were expected to support this maneuver. Luftwaffe protection, though diminished, was still assumed to provide limited cover. These assumptions were already outdated. Allied air dominance over France had reached a level that fundamentally altered operational reality. Daylight movement of large formations was increasingly impossible. Rail lines were systematically destroyed. Bridges were targeted. Road junctions were interdicted continuously. German units moved at night, slowly, and often under attack. Despite mounting evidence, institutional confidence persisted. German intelligence assessments reinforced this confidence. Signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and reports from occupied Europe consistently indicated that the largest Allied concentration was opposite the Pas de Calais. This aligned with geographic logic. Calais offered the shortest crossing. It lay closest to major ports. It appeared the most efficient route into Germany. These conclusions were further reinforced by Allied deception efforts. False radio traffic suggested large formations preparing for a landing in the north. Double agents reported troop movements consistent with a Calais operation. Dummy landing craft and visible preparations were observed from the French coast. As a result, German planners elevated probability into certainty. Normandy was classified as a secondary threat. defensive resources were allocated accordingly. While beach obstacles and fortifications were constructed, the density and depth of forces were insufficient to repel a major landing. Infantry divisions in the sector were often under strength and lacked mobility. The armored reserve question remained unresolved. Rommel argued that armored units must be positioned close to the beaches, even at the risk of naval fire. Hunstedt and others insisted they be held inland. This disagreement was never formally resolved. Authority over the panzer divisions was fragmented, split between theatre command and direct control from Berlin. This fragmentation reflected a deeper problem. Adolf Hitler retained personal authority over the commitment of strategic reserves. His intervention was intended to prevent premature or misdirected use of armored forces. In practice, it ensured delay. German command thus operated under a dual illusion: that the invasion site could be identified with certainty, and that sufficient time would exist to respond once it occurred. Both assumptions would prove false. Reports warning of Allied air dominance, logistical paralysis, and the risks of delayed response were received and recorded. They did not alter planning. Doctrine remained intact. Confidence in established methods outweighed adaptation to changing conditions. The conclusion reached by German leadership was clear and internally consistent. The decisive battle would be fought inland, after the enemy revealed himself. This conclusion shaped every subsequent decision. When the invasion came, it would not fail because German commanders misunderstood the threat. It would fail because they understood it through a framework no longer suited to the war they were fighting. The warning that challenged German assumptions did not come from intelligence failure or retrospective analysis. It came from within the command structure itself, articulated repeatedly and in formal terms by a senior field commander actively responsible for the defense of the Western Front. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel did not dispute that an Allied landing could occur at Pas-de-Calais. His warning concerned something more fundamental: timing. He argued that the decisive phase of the invasion would not come days later, but within the first hours. Rommel's assessment rested on observable operational realities. Allied air power had achieved near total dominance over northern France. German movement during daylight hours had become hazardous at every level. Even individual vehicles were targeted. Rail traffic had been systematically disrupted. Road movement was constrained by constant interdiction. Under these conditions, Rommel concluded that traditional German counterattack doctrine no longer functioned as intended. He stated explicitly in reports and conferences that armored reserves held inland would not reach the battlefield in time. Units delayed by air attack, traffic congestion, and command authorization would arrive only after Allied forces had secured beachheads, brought in artillery, and established defensive depth. Once this occurred, German counterattacks would face overwhelming firepower. Rommel's proposed solution was clear. Armored units had to be positioned close enough to the coast to intervene immediately. Even partial commitment during the first hours, he argued, offered a chance to disrupt landings before Allied forces consolidated. Delay would be irreversible. This position placed Rommel in direct conflict with senior commanders and institutional doctrine. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt continued to argue that committing armor too close to the coast would result in its destruction by naval gunfire. In his view, armored forces were a strategic asset, not a tactical one. Their premature loss would eliminate Germany's only means of restoring the situation once the main invasion axis was identified. This disagreement was not resolved through compromise. Instead, it was neutralized through fragmentation of authority. Command responsibility for armored reserves was divided. Some divisions were assigned to Rommel's Army Group B. Others remained under direct control of higher headquarters. Several required authorization from Adolf Hitler personally before movement or commitment. This structure effectively prevented rapid decision-making. Rommel's warnings were delivered through official channels. They were recorded in memoranda and discussed in conferences. They did not result in doctrinal change. No unified command authority over armored reserves was established. No clear trigger conditions for immediate counterattack were defined. The reasons were institutional rather than personal. German command culture prioritized adherence to established doctrine. Mobile defense had succeeded repeatedly earlier in the war. Deviating from it required not only evidence, but institutional willingness to abandon precedent. That willingness did not exist in 1944. Additionally, intelligence assessments continued to reinforce existing beliefs. Reports consistently emphasized Allied strength opposite Pas-de-Calais. Normandy was treated as a supporting axis. Rommel's conclusions, though operationally grounded, conflicted with what intelligence appeared to confirm. Time pressure also worked against adaptation. By early June 1944, defensive preparations were already underway. Altering force disposition would have required large-scale redeployment under Allied air attack. The cost and risk of such movement were cited as reasons for inaction. Delay was rationalized as prudence. Rommel's warning thus entered a bureaucratic vacuum. It was acknowledged, debated, and then absorbed without consequence. No formal rejection was issued. No decisive endorsement followed. Instead, the warning was left unresolved within a system that required clarity to function. When the invasion began, the conditions Rommel had described materialized precisely. Communication delays, air interdiction, and fragmented authority prevented timely commitment of reserves. Units waited for orders that arrived too late to matter. The warning had not been ignored in the sense of being unheard. It had been ignored in the sense of being institutionally unanswerable. The German command entered the decisive battle of the Western Front without having resolved its most fundamental internal disagreement. The Allied landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 immediately tested every assumption that had shaped German defensive planning. The outcome was not determined by surprise alone. It was determined by the interaction between doctrine and conditions that no longer allowed that doctrine to function. In the early hours of the invasion, German coastal units reported airborne landings inland and amphibious assaults along multiple beaches. Initial assessments were confused. Some commanders interpreted the landings as diversionary actions. Others reported them as major operations. The absence of clear confirmation reinforced existing beliefs that the main effort would still occur elsewhere. Authorization to commit armored reserves did not come immediately. Several panzer divisions remained stationary during the opening hours, awaiting confirmation and approval. This delay was not the result of indecision at the tactical level. It was a consequence of the command structure that governed their use. Movement required authorization from higher headquarters, and in some cases, direct approval from Adolf Hitler himself. As these decisions were delayed, Allied forces consolidated. On the beaches, Allied troops absorbed losses but continued landing men, vehicles, and artillery in increasing numbers. Naval gunfire suppressed many fixed defensive positions. Engineers cleared obstacles. Beach exits were opened. Within hours, the landings transitioned from survival to expansion. German attempts to respond encountered the conditions Rommel had predicted. Air interdiction dominated movement. Roads became impassable during daylight. Bridges were destroyed or heavily damaged. Units attempting to move toward the coast did so slowly, often at night, and under constant threat. Coordination between divisions was disrupted. Timetables collapsed. When armored units finally began moving, they did so piecemeal. Counterattacks lacked mass. They were launched by individual formations rather than coordinated corps-level actions. Allied air forces targeted columns en route. Fuel shortages compounded delays. Units arrived fatigued, under strength, and without adequate infantry or artillery support. At the operational level, the decisive window closed rapidly. By the time German armored formations reached the battlefield in strength, Allied forces had established defensive depth. Anti-tank weapons were deployed. Artillery was operational. Air-ground coordination was fully active. German attacks achieved limited tactical successes, but failed to dislodge Allied beachheads. The inland counterattack doctrine assumed maneuver freedom. That freedom did not exist. German commanders attempted to apply established methods under conditions that negated their effectiveness. Each logical decision produced diminishing returns. Delay compounded disadvantage. Movement invited destruction. Concentration became impossible. Meanwhile, Allied doctrine functioned as intended. The Allied plan accepted initial casualties in exchange for rapid buildup. Commanders prioritized continuity of landing over immediate exploitation. Once established, Allied forces relied on logistics, air power, and numerical superiority to absorb and defeat counterattacks. By mid-June, the outcome was no longer in doubt. German forces remained engaged, but the strategic initiative had shifted irreversibly. Normandy was no longer a beachhead, it was a front. The opportunity to contain the invasion at the shoreline had passed. Rommel's assessment had been operationally accurate. The decisive battle had occurred not days later, but in the first hours. The failure to act immediately was not corrected by later effort. German doctrine had collided with a battlefield shaped by air power, logistics, and time constraints it could no longer overcome. The invasion did not succeed because German commanders failed to respond. It succeeded because the response that doctrine required could no longer be executed. Within days of the Allied landings, German command assessments began to change in tone. Early reports that had framed the invasion as potentially containable gave way to more sober evaluations. The shift was not immediate, but it was documented. Field reports from Normandy indicated that Allied forces were no longer vulnerable to localized counterattack. Beachheads had merged, artillery was fully deployed, supply flows increased steadily, air superiority was uninterrupted. German attempts to regain initiative failed to achieve operational effect. Internal communications reflected this reality. Commanders reported that armored units committed after the first day encountered prepared defenses rather than exposed landing forces. Losses were incurred without corresponding gains. Requests for reinforcement increased even as mobility decreased. The operational situation was described as unfavorable and deteriorating. At higher headquarters, the implications became unavoidable. The premise underlying inland counterattack doctrine had been invalidated. The assumption of time to observe, decide, and maneuver, had proven incorrect. Allied forces had not required days to consolidate. They required hours. Once those hours passed, the opportunity was gone. This realization did not produce a single formal admission. It emerged through accumulated reporting. After-action summaries noted that delayed commitment of reserves had reduced their effectiveness. Analyses highlighted the impact of Allied air interdiction on movement and coordination. The inability to concentrate forces under constant aerial attack was acknowledged as a decisive constraint. The recognition extended beyond Normandy. German planners concluded that similar conditions would exist across the Western Front. Any future attempt to restore mobility would face the same limitations. The operational environment had changed permanently. Rommel's earlier assessments were now cited indirectly. His emphasis on immediate action at the shoreline was no longer contested. What had been presented as a disputable interpretation before the invasion became an operational conclusion afterward. However, recognition did not translate into remedy. German forces lacked the resources to restructure command authority or reposition reserves effectively. Allied pressure increased continuously. The front expanded. Opportunities for decisive intervention disappeared. Institutional consequences followed. Command authority disputes diminished not because they were resolved, but because options narrowed. Decisions became reactive. Defensive efforts focused on delaying rather than reversing Allied advances. The concept of restoring the situation gave way to managing collapse. Within weeks, the Normandy front transitioned into a war of attrition unfavorable to Germany. Casualties mounted. Equipment losses could not be replaced. Operational freedom vanished. The failure was no longer framed as misjudgment of a single operation. It was understood as a failure to adapt doctrine to reality. The warning had been correct. The conclusion drawn from it had come too late. The consequences of the decisions made before 6th of June 1944 unfolded rapidly and irreversibly. Once Allied forces secured Normandy, the German position in Western Europe entered a phase defined not by recovery, but by attrition and retreat. The failure to defeat the invasion at the shoreline determined the strategic trajectory of the war in the West. German forces continued to fight with discipline and tactical competence. Counterattacks were mounted. Defensive lines were organized. Local successes occurred. None altered the fundamental imbalance created during the first hours of the landings. Allied superiority in air power, logistics, and manpower expanded with each passing day. By July 1944, the German army in Normandy faced mounting pressure along an increasingly congested front. Maneuver space disappeared, supply shortages intensified, command flexibility narrowed. The conditions required for mobile defense no longer existed. The collapse that followed was operational rather than sudden. Allied breakout operations exploited accumulated German weakness. Once Allied forces broke out of Normandy, German units lacked the reserves and mobility to seal penetrations. Retreat turned into pursuit. France was lost within weeks. The strategic consequences extended beyond territory. The destruction of German forces in the West eliminated any realistic possibility of stabilizing the front. Resources diverted to Normandy could not be replaced. The loss of France exposed Germany's western border. It accelerated the convergence of Allied and Soviet advances. The failure also carried institutional consequences. German command doctrine had been rendered obsolete by conditions it could not overcome. The belief that operational flexibility could compensate for material and air inferiority was disproven. Doctrine based on maneuver without air parity no longer functioned. The warning that had anticipated this outcome was documented before the invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had argued that the decisive battle would occur at the moment of landing. He had warned that delay would be fatal. His assessment was grounded in observation, not theory. It challenged precedent. It conflicted with institutional assumptions. It was not acted upon. The verdict of history does not rest on individual error alone. The failure was systemic. It resulted from fragmented authority, rigid doctrine, and overconfidence in methods shaped by earlier phases of the war. The German command structure acknowledged the warning, but could not adapt to it. The outcome was decided before the invasion moved inland. Normandy did not succeed because German forces failed to fight. It succeeded because the German command system failed to resolve its own contradictions before the decisive moment arrived. That failure ended Germany's ability to defend Western Europe.